Apple has got two different MacBook Airs on sale right now. There's the classic M1 Air, there's the brand new M2 Air. Frankly, there's a lot that's the same about them, but also a lot of differences, so I'm going to help you try to figure out which MacBook Air you need. So I've started using Apple's new MacBook Air with the new M2 chip in it that's only been out for a little while. Frankly, I'd like it a lot. Our review of it was very positive, but at the same time, Apple is still selling this guy. This is the M1 MacBook Air, which has the same look and feel and design as the Intel MacBook Airs that came before it. This is literally the 2020 version of the laptop. Apple's still selling it, and obviously here in 2022, we also have this guy, which is the new, updated, refreshed MacBook Air. It's not just the chip inside that's different, it's a bunch of other things in the design and the features. So let's take a look and see what exactly the differences are, and maybe why you want to spend a little bit more on this guy, or you want to spend a little bit less on this guy, because the M1 MacBook Air is still available for that classic $1,000 MacBook Air price. The new version, they jumped it up to $1,200. I'm not happy about it. You're not happy about it. You can still get that $1,000 MacBook Air, but is it worth another $200? Well, we're going to take a look and find out. All right, the first difference that you're going to see, obviously, is in the design. This MacBook Air, the M1, looks a lot like previous MacBook Airs, frankly, going back many years. This new version, the M2, it's a completely new design, also has new colors. I frankly think it's the biggest change to the MacBook Air's design since the line was introduced back in 2008. The big difference here is that this Air has adopted the kind of flat, squared-off design of the current 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro. So the top of the lid is completely flat. It doesn't kind of curve around the edges. It doesn't have that taper anymore. It's one thickness throughout. I think it's a cooler, more modern look, but much more important than that, you actually get some new color options. Before now, you could get a MacBook Air in gray and silver and gold. Now you can also get midnight. This midnight color, it's a deep black with kind of a bluish tinge. It reminds me a lot of that classic black MacBook from the mid-2000s, before there even was an Air. That was just called the MacBook, and it was made of plastic, now obviously aluminum. I really like the matte black look, although it does pick up a lot of fingerprints. Weight-wise, they're virtually the same. I think they start at 2.7 pounds versus 2.8 pounds. This is a little bit thinner overall. This obviously gets a little thinner at the front where it tapers, but it's thicker at the back. But frankly, carrying it around every day-wise, you're not going to feel a big difference. You're going to choose this new design because you want the newer design or you want the cool color, and that's totally legit. The next big difference between these two is screen size. Now, this is still a 13-inch laptop, whether you go with the M1 or the M2, but the M1 has got a regular 13.3-inch diagonally measured display. That's a very common screen size. For the new MacBook Air, it's a 13.6-inch display, so it's just a little bit larger, and you can see the lids are just about the same size, but the bezel is smaller here, so they fit a little more screen into the same space, with one little asterisk, and that's this little notch guy up here, but we're going to get back to that later. Another important thing to note about the screen is that on the new M2 Air, the screen actually gets brighter. I think it's a 500 nit screen, very similar to what you find in the MacBook Pros. Comparatively, the M1 MacBook Air screen is fine. It gets plenty bright, but it's not as bright. And that could be important if, I don't know, you're working outside at a cafe in the sunlight and you just need an extra bright screen. The real big difference between these two, the reason they really exist, at least on paper, is that they have different chips inside. They're both Apple Silicon systems, which is a big change from a few years ago when Macs all had Intel chips inside. Apple has moved away from that to their own chips. The M1 was the first Apple Silicon chip, and that is in this MacBook Air and a few other products. Well, now they've got the M2, and that goes in the new MacBook Air and the new 13-inch Pro. Those are the first two devices to have the M2 chip. So yes, it's a little bit faster. Running benchmarks on the M1 Air and the M2 Air, it was faster, but it wasn't so much so that I would go and ditch my M1 just to get the M2 version. In fact, if you need a lot more speed, a lot more power, you're going to be trading up to something in the 14-inch or 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is the M1 Pro chip or the M1 Max chip. And then in the Mac Studio desktop, you can get the M1 Ultra chip, and those are all much, much faster than either the M1 or the M2. Now, MacBook Air laptops have always embraced a certain minimalism when it comes to ports and connections. I remember the very first MacBook Air back in 2008, I think just had one USB-A port, and that was it on the entire thing. In the modern era, MacBook Airs have had two USB-C Thunderbolt ports, and that continues both on the old Air and the new Air. No HDMI, no SD card slot, anything like that. You have to go to the Pros to get that. There is, however, one new port, I should say a returning port on the M2 MacBook Air, and that is the MagSafe power connection. So you have two USB-Cs and the MagSafe connector here. Here you just have the two USB-Cs. Both still have headphone jacks, which is not something you can always count on in tech products these days, but I'm glad they're still in both of these. Now, personally, I find it hard to carry an extra proprietary cable around, so even though this has MagSafe, I 99% of the time charge this just using the same USB-C cable I use for this or any other USB-C device that I have. But beyond all of that, I really think the biggest point of differentiation and the biggest reason I would choose the new M2 version of the MacBook Air over the M1 version is the webcam. We finally have an updated modern version of the webcam here in the M2 MacBook Air, because here in the M1 Air and the last several generations of MacBook Air before that, these have had 720 resolution cameras, basically low-res cameras that were kind of dated, and nobody ever thought they looked very good. Especially because we spent the last 2.5 years doing a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of FaceTime meetings, a lot of video chatting. The camera really is much more important than it used to be, and these were just not keeping up. So here in the M2 MacBook Air, you got a 1080 camera, a full HD camera. You could also now get that on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and the 24-inch iMac. So 1080 cameras are slowly taking over the Mac line. They're not everywhere yet, but it's the standard now for new Macs, except for that new 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. That's a whole nother topic. And I'm happy to see it because, frankly, side by side, it looks a lot better. It's not just the increased resolution in the camera, although that helps. The image processing is also a lot better. And if you look at some clips side by side, you can definitely tell the difference. Now, you do have to give something up to get this new camera. Of course you do. That is the screen notch up here, which is similar to the one on the iPhone that either really bothers you a lot or you just get used to and you don't notice anymore. So cut into the screen, camera notch, versus over here, the top bezel is thicker so the camera module just fits into it and it doesn't cut into the screen at all. Your tolerance for this will vary based on, how much you're going to be able to mentally ignore it and how much you're just going to obsess over it. Along with the camera, I should also note that the M1 MacBook Air's got 2 speakers in it. The M2 version has 4 speakers. None of these are fantastic for audio. Frankly, the microphones are pretty good for, webcam chatting and things like that. But that's not going to make the decision for you one way or the other. If you want to find out more about all the little details of the M1 versus the M2, we've got a full review of the M2. We've got a lot of comparison stories about them. You can find all those links in the description below. I think at the end of the day, the big decision points for you are going to be price, $999 to start versus $1,200 to start. It's going to be the design, obviously the new colors and shape versus the old, and it's going to be the webcam and other new features. Do you need the higher res webcam? Do you need the M2 chip? Do you really love MagSafe and want to have it in your MacBook Air? If so, even at $1,200, the new MacBook Air is reasonably priced, and I still think of the Air as one of the most universally useful laptops you can buy. That said, if you just want the $1,000 plain version, even though this model is a couple years old at this point, I was using it regularly up until a couple weeks ago when I started using and testing this. This one still works fine, still great for students, still great for taking out to the coffee shop with you, easy to put in your bag and take anywhere. So I'm glad Apple still offers a $1,000 version of the MacBook Air, even if you can't get the cool new midnight color.